Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome two great people for actually what's the last fireside chat of this conference. It's a relatively short one, so we're trying to pack a lot into this period, which we're a bit challenged on, actually. So I'd like to introduce two people. First, Saumya Bhavsar, who's the head of legal FinTech and vice president of Meta. Saumya is bringing the outside-in US perspective on this story. And secondly, Thomas Zickler, the CFO of Sulzer. And Thomas is representing a proud Swiss-European company of about 200 years. So quite different perspectives the two of you are both bringing. So the topic here is about Europe's competitiveness. Now that, of course, has been a theme of the conference for the last 1.5 days. And what we want to do here is to focus on what are the concrete actions we can take out of this. As also a proud European with one hand in Africa, I'm quite keen to see what are the opportunities we can take out of the challenges that we've been facing and we've been looking at the last couple of days. So to give some background, we heard some data, but I'd like to repeat it because it's actually quite interesting. So Europe has a 17 trillion euro GDP economy. We're 450 million people in Europe, representing actually the largest trading bloc in the world. Of course, we have some challenges. We know we have an aging population. We know we have a high cost of doing business. And we know that the regulation is causing a lot of concern to a bunch of people. It's been a theme throughout the conference here today. So I'd like to pick up on a couple of themes with Saumya and Thomas. And the first theme I want to pick up is actually on regulation. And I will come to Saumya in a second. So Saumya, looking at this from a US company, which actually is doing business in Europe, but it has no influence and control over the standards that are applied to your US company. I'm very curious on how you look at regulation, and let me just give some background here. The AI Act has been discussed quite a lot the last day and a half, and I'd like to see really what the perspective is from a US organization. The AI Act has two important elements. As an ABSL board, we were quite lucky to be present in Brussels around 2 months ago, where actually we met some of the individuals who designed and drafted the AI Act. And it has two important requirements. The first is that actually you cannot do bad. So make sure your AI models don't do harm. So you can't have bias, you can't actually harm individuals on safety or health through the AI Act. And second, to make sure that we don't have a zoo of AI regulation in Europe. If they didn't get ahead of the curve and issue an AI Act before the 27 countries all created AI Acts, it would be very difficult to use AI tools for all of you. All of you are present in many countries. How would you operate if there's different rules in every country? So my question to you, Saumya, is, are we in danger of complaining too much about regulation in Europe rather than seeing the opportunities and embracing them and looking as a way of using those?
Thanks, Derek. So I would start off with a quote which I found particularly insightful and amusing. It's by Nicholas Tangen, who is a hedge fund manager and actually right now manages the largest sovereign wealth fund for Norway at 1.6 trillion. And he said, in the US, you have a lot of AI and no regulation. In Europe, you have no AI and a lot of regulation. Well, I'm not sure if that's exactly correct, but I think it proves a point, which is, first of all, I know you've heard a lot at the conference about the need to simplify regulation. Right now, we have, and if you look at, since the EU announced its single digital market, we started in like 2015 with about 7 laws, and now we're at 2024 with about 88 laws. The question is, I think we always have to look at regulation as, does it serve the need that it's designed for? And one of the things that we really need to do, I think, in Europe, and the US is obviously at the other end of the spectrum, and I don't know if Europe, I'm not advising Europe to adopt the US way, because I think from a mentality perspective, and we discussed this yesterday, from a fundamental ethos perspective, it's very difficult to bridge that gap. But I think one tangible thing that can be done is ensuring that we distinguish between large corporations and SMEs. I think it's really important to design regulations that don't unduly burden with the cost of compliance small and medium enterprises and enable growth of those entities by ensuring that they have an opportunity to do business without having the burden of compliance. The other thing is, I think, ensuring within the GBS sector that you see AI as an opportunity. It's an opportunity just as the GBS sector started going from back office to risk management, and very complex risk management, right? Credit, didn't matter what the type of risk was, but look for gaps that are not being covered. AI is obviously new frontier. There's a lot of hype in AI too, but I do think that looking for opportunities and how, maybe even in the risk management space, you can get ahead of coming up with ways to ensure compliance with AI and marketing that to businesses globally.
And do you think that's an opportunity? So, because let's say the GBS department finds a way to comply with the AI regulation, at some point the US, Canada will introduce AI regulation. Do you think they'll be the same or similar, so that actually the department that created the AI compliance for the EU, the company's presence in Canada, they're the first out the gate versus the Canadian companies who just realize, oh, there's this rule that has to come in, I've got to comply with it?
I think by nature, if you look at, and I analogize it to GDPR, GDPR, once again, came out of the EU. Any US company that does business in Europe must comply with GDPR. Similarly, that would apply to the AI Act. But what ends up happening is that these regulatory regimes set a global standard because multinational companies cannot comply with different laws in, let's say, a big space like GDPR in each individual market. So they have to adopt kind of like a one-size-fits-all. And this is probably what's going to happen with the AI Act too. They're going to have to harmonize their compliance approach for simplification purposes across their global footprint.
Okay, maybe Thomas, coming to you, actually looking at the role of technology, taking it a bit further. And I'm going to start with a quote from Karl Marx, which I know is funny in a business environment. So this quote was issued in 1857. "The saving of labor time is equal to an increase in free time, i.e. time for the development of the individual, which in turn reacts back into the productive power of labor as itself as the greatest productive power." So Thomas, over to you. To what extent is technology in your company enabling the increase in that productive power already?
So I think the technology is one of the most important things which we in Europe have really to go after. And when I talk about Sulzer, just to give you a brief summary of Sulzer, we were inherited almost 200 years ago when we started with, say, diesel motors, then we started with turbo compressors, then we even built locomotives. Nowadays, we are doing chemical process engineering, we are in the bioplastics, in biochemicals, we do wastewater treatment, and you see how we developed. So development of IT and of technology is one of the most important things for us, for the European companies, which we can do. But I would be very cautious on this, because when we talk now all about AI, what is AI? We all used AI in the past when we used Google or Explorer. This is AI. This is based on language models. So when we now talk about technology and AI in the future, this means that we need for this engineering power, engineering know-how. And where is this engineering know-how coming from? In most of the cases, still from Europe, still from Switzerland. You know, for example, in Switzerland, we have the ETH there. We are very proud that we have this advantage on the engineering side. And this builds the base for the future AI development in the industry sector. Yes, the Americans, they are in the forefront of, say, everything which is related to the internet, to the language models. But now our time will come when we talk about industry and production efficiency and so on. So really technology is the key for success in the future. And I think when we talk about technology, We have here in Europe a very good base for the next couple of years to go back to where we were some decades ago when it comes to industrial processing. I give you one example. When we look in the robotics, you see that robotics is actually coming more from Europe than, say, for example, from Americas. Now, when we look in all the production processes, you will see in the future totally different factories. You will see factories where we have robots. The robots, they are working then 24/7. You don't have to discuss with unions. So we have really a lot of things which we can do in the future to make a workplace Europe much more attractive for all of us.
So that probably leads nicely on to something I want to take further in terms of the people. Because, of course, the innovation, the designing of the robots, the supervising of the AI tools needs a person to do that. And this is a question to both of you, because, of course, you're in Silicon Valley, the home of innovation, everyone's excited, you know, having coffee and meeting people in the coffee shop. And that creates innovation, of course, because people discuss stuff. Do we have the right environment or the right people to do what you're talking about, Thomas? Do we have that, or is that something we need to somehow drive?
I absolutely think that in Europe we have the right people, we have a good educational system, we have good universities, but unfortunately, when we have really good guys, what do they do then? In most of the cases, they go to the Americas. They go to California, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why is this happening? Why can't we make for our employees, for our workers, for our workforce here in Europe, why can't we make it more attractive to stay in Europe, to develop in Europe the new things, and not really move abroad? This is very important.
Maybe I can pick up on that also. I think when I first moved to Silicon Valley, it's pretty an eye-opening experience. First of all, walking around campus, and I think this is the case with all big tech, the vast majority of technical experts are foreigners. I mean, they're Asian. In fact, there's stats on, they're usually above 50% of the engineering staff. US is very good at realizing what it doesn't have and targeting from other countries what it should have for the betterment of the economy. When my dad emigrated to the US, there was a shortage of doctors. He was able to go to the US because of being a doctor. The same with engineering. If you see in the US, there's a proliferation of, and we'll see that under Trump, it may change, but there's a proliferation of engineers. I think understanding where the needs are of Europe in terms of technical skilled labor is going to be very important, and attracting those, making it easier for immigration, is going to be really critically important to increasing the competitiveness of Europe. The other thing I would say is, referring to one of the other points that Thomas made, he's absolutely right. I was surprised to see how many engineers and of European origin are in the US. In fact, I was talking to a colleague very early on at Meta, and I don't know how many of you guys ever had Deezer, but Deezer was like an early version of Spotify. It was a streaming music service. The founder of Deezer was actually in Silicon Valley. He was working with one of my colleagues. There's so many Europeans, and absolutely agree. What happens with a lot of startups here is that they get very early stage funding, but it's the later stage funding that they cannot get because they haven't produced the revenue returns, and so they go to the US. They go to the US for later stage funding, and they end up moving their company and headquartering in the US. So that's something else that I think we need to ensure that there's institutional investment to encourage startups to stay in Europe. And governments should be consumers of technology that our companies are producing. That's what they do in the US, right? DOD and all of that. Yeah. Governments need to be consumers. Yeah. Encourage your industries to grow.
Yeah, you led very nicely on to my closing question. So we have Prime Minister Letter coming afterwards. Yeah. If there's one thing you could ask the politicians in Europe to do, what would you ask? Maybe you've already answered your own question, yes, actually. Yes. Thomas?
I'm fully in line with Saumya here, because what we have not here in Europe, and we have some places like Berlin and in some Nordic countries where we have a startup community. So what I really would ask is that when it comes to investments talking about startups, innovation, that we get here a regulatory framework in Europe which would enable all these super brains to stay here in Europe, also from the financing side, so that they get the funds, but not the funds from, say, from the EU and not the funds from the governments. No, we have to set up an environment where we get private capital into these startups here in Europe. And when we achieve this, I think we won the battle.
Thank you both. So this was a very brief fireside chat, as you've heard. So just to summarize, I think very good feedback. I hope Prime Minister Letta was listening to that. If not, we can mention it on the way out. Just one closing thought I would issue. So I've sat in the audience many times as a GBS leader, like many of you. And what do I take away from the conference? I would go back to my company, specifically on one point, on the regulation, and see how I could build compliance in my department. Because this little tiny thing can enable your company to access the AI environment. Because without that, you could be in trouble. So this is a service you can offer. This is concrete action you can take away from you. But I'd like to thank Saumya and Thomas for your insightful feedback, and enjoy the last two sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.